Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices for a Fast, Responsive, Searchable ASP.NET Grid, presented by DevExpress Web Program Manager Mehul Harry. In this session, you'll learn some best practices for creating a fast, searchable grid that can work in a responsive website with Bootstrap. We'll explore how to set up data access and grid options, plus how to add Bootstrap to your website. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul.
Thank you, Amanda. And as Amanda just described, this is best practices for creating a fast, responsive, searchable ASP.NET Grid. Welcome everybody. I'm excited to talk about ASP.NET again, and we're going to be talking mostly about ASP.NET Web Forms, but it's applicable to our MVC grid, and we're going to show a little bit, very little bit of some upcoming Bootstrap controls we've got coming, but I'm going to save that for a future webinar. In this webinar, what I want to focus on is particularly a type of a scenario. So ASP.NET gets beat up a lot for sometimes saying, people nowadays are like, oh, client side is so much faster, it's responsive. It's all about how you design something. And so we created a sample to show off some best practices considerations for creating and using a grid in a certain scenario. What's the scenario? Well, we've got this, the good news is everything I'm going to show today is we've got this Code Central sample. It's a full-on Visual Studio sample solution that you can download. Now, don't worry about, necessarily going through this right now, because that's what I'm going to be showing in this webinar, exactly how to build this, what the considerations were, but mostly to discuss why we're doing certain things in this sample. So we're going to discuss all of that today. Now, what exactly is the sample? It's an online mobile-friendly web dictionary lookup. So we've got one of our developers. He's big time into yoga and Ayurvedic and stuff. So he found this Ayurvedic dictionary, and what it is, it's a set of terms that's produced by the National Institute of Ayurveda, and in it are 5,000 plus terms. Now, these terms talk about a particular meaning, the original pronunciation, all that good stuff. But if you were ever curious about these terms, well, this is the official dictionary. And so we took this dictionary, imported it into an Access database, and said, well, what would it look like if we were able to present this in a fast searchable grid? And so we've created a version with aspx grid view and the upcoming Bootstrap grid view. But essentially, it helps you to create a list view with our grid. Now, this is 5,000 plus terms, and you can see we've got mobile-friendly buttons, we've got a list view using the grid, and if I want to search through these 5,000 items, I can type in a item in here, and the online search filter kicks in and automatically filters those items very quickly. Now, beyond that, you can see, if I bring up the developer tools here, that we can also hit F12 here, and we can take a look and see what it looks like in a mobile view, in a responsive view. So as you can see, I've got a couple of menu buttons up here. And as I start resizing this, you can see we've got Bootstrap enabled in here. So as I start losing real estate, we get the hamburger menu. So it's also mobile friendly. Now, the grid itself is resizing too. So you can see the grid has some responsive features. So how do we design this in a way so that it's responsive, mobile friendly, but it's also fast for multiple sets of users? Because if I've got it enabled for mobile and desktop, I'm expecting that this scenario, I'm expecting lots of people to hit this website. So how do you design such a website with ASP.NET? And that's what I want to talk about today. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda. And that is, I'm going to be talking about that sample. And in the sample, I'll be talking about how we set up data access so that way we can have a scalable ASP.NET site. What does a grid user interface look like? How do you create that list view? And then what are the necessary features of the UI that you want to think about, that you need, because it's sort of like that Yagni principle. You ain't gonna need it. So don't enable something if you don't need it. So we're gonna talk a little bit about what feature considerations we took in this demo to enable or disable certain items and why that's important. And then how do you set it up so that this site is SEO friendly? And this is an important consideration because these days, if you're not indexed by Google or one of the search engines, Bing and so forth, and they like a website that they can page through. And so how do we set this up? And I will discuss that as well. And finally, we're going to use Bootstrap to make our website mobile friendly. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to bring Bootstrap in and start working with our controls. In fact, the current ASP.NET controls. All right, so most everything I'm going to show you today is code, so let's just dive in. Now, for this webinar, I am going to use Visual Studio 2017 because Julian's been blogging about how we are compatible, and I want to test it out. But more, I also just want to show you that we're not just compatible with Visual Studio 2017, but it's got some nice little features in it. They've changed the new getting started page here, but you can find the standard templates under more project templates, or the files new project is also the same. So I'm going to start off by using the DevExpress template gallery. Now let's call it grid best practices, I don't know, 101 or something. And then I'm going to want to click on ASP.NET, and I'm going to select empty web application. And that's because we want to build everything from scratch. Now, it's not completely empty. So what it is it sets up a project that has DevExpress enabled within it. So the only thing I'm going to change is I'm going to choose a different theme, and I'm going to choose Moderno. And it's Moderno's, as you know, our mobile-friendly theme that looks really nice as well. And under site configuration, I'm going to make one other change, and that is the request validation. I'm going to change it from 4.0 to 2.0. All right, so let's talk about this. What is request validation and why am I changing it? So request validation, if you're not familiar, is a security feature of ASP.NET. It allows you to examine HTTP requests, determine whether they're potentially dangerous. So why would I want to degrade down to 4.0? Well, because 4.0 can be very strict, meaning that there are considerations for this grid that we may find useful. And in Microsoft themselves acknowledge this, and they said, look, there are reasons you may want to disable request validation. And for example, it helps us to fight, cross-site scripting attacks, and so that people don't inject code into your site that can potentially get at your data. So in our case, if I, for example, in the grid view, want to do some kind of special filtering like less than D, what'll happen is it's going to pop up an error because request validation on this page says, nope, sorry, a potentially dangerous thing came in and I'm not going to allow it, which is great, which is what we want to do. But if you see, we've also enabled it for one of the particular pages. So for example, on the Bootstrap grid view, we can do it because I've disabled validation. Well, I not disabled validation. I've set it to 2.0. So what's nice about it is we can set it per page. Now, this is important to consider because not every page needs it, because my grid view is really just a list here and I don't have any editing enabled. I don't have to worry so much that people may inject some items in here. And you can also take some precautions on the server side, making sure that every item that can potentially touch your database has been protected. And if you're curious about that, we've done webinars in the past that dive deeper into security. All right, so that's request validation. So for this particular purpose, I'm going to set it to 2.0. And once I hit create project, it's essentially going to create a very bare bones project that has references to the assemblies necessary to use DevExpress ASP.NET controls, and it's set up our web config. So there it is. Visual Studio 2017, and here's our web config with our DevExpress assembly references, request validation set, and also our Moderno theme. Next, we want to bring in our data. So we can see I've got app data here. So for this webinar, what you can do is you can just bring in the webinar directly. Now, because this is a Code Central sample, you'll see that you can, if you've installed our example runner before, you can click example runner and it's a one-time install. But every time after that, when you click example, what it will do, it will download this item. It will figure out which version you have installed. So even if you're on, 16.2.4, it will still open this sample up and convert the references and so forth and open it right into your Visual Studio. Now you might say, well, where exactly is this stored locally? Well, when you first install the samples, generally you'll install into your My Documents samples, and based on what the sample is, it'll install into the particular product. So aspx grid view, and here's the sample. So what I want to do is I want to bring in this access database. So we're just going to right click on app data here and say add existing item, and browse over, and it will create a copy of this in our app data. Now, for this webinar, I don't really want to use any particular data access technology. What I want to do is I want to create a new folder where I'm going to make my own data access. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a typical ASP.NET folder called app code. Now, app code is where we can store certain app code files, and in it we're going to add a class. To the class, we'll call it Ayurvedic Online Dictionary. I'm going to try to keep the samples as similar as the code that you see. So let me call it Ayurvedic Dictionary, so that if you want to follow along and create a similar thing, you can do that as well. Oops, let me close Visual Studio there. All right, so our online Ayurvedic dictionary provider is pretty bare bones. You could use a particular technology. The reason I want to kind of step through this is to show you that there's a certain consideration for this particular scenario that says, listen, we've got essentially just a very plain list view, and I could get a lot of people accessing it. So how do I set that up for my data access technology? So what we're going to do is, not only are we going to create our own version that can talk to it, we're going to make it set it up in a way that makes it simple and reusable. So the very first thing is, let's take a look at our database. So if you double click on the Access database, it should open up Microsoft Access, and we can see we've got one table in there called terms. And here's all our 5,000 plus terms. And in it, we've got a certain set of columns: ID, code, Devanagari, the international something something term, and as well as the English meaning. So we're interested in a few of these terms, and we're going to set them up in a way so that we're using just one column of the grid. So what I want to do is, let's create, even though I'm not using any particular object technology, we still want to have an object representation. So I'm going to create this public class called Dictionary Ayurvedic Dictionary Term that represents the columns that I intend to use. Now, in our dictionary provider, we can refer to this. So the first thing I want to do is I want to have, and by the way, just for the sake of time, I'm going to avoid typing as much as possible. And so our first item that we need is a string that holds where the database is, and obviously it's in our app data folder. So this file path will store this. Now, next, I want to have a way to store the terms. So I've got an object that says, look, each term has these properties in it, and then I'm going to need a list of those terms. So here, I want to say that I want to create a list of Ayurvedic dictionary terms, and it's basically a property of our dictionary provider. So as is probably evident to you by now, this provider is what is going to be our data source for our grid. All right, Next, I want to create a variable. So this time I will just type it to kind of tell you it's going to be a private static read-only object. And it is, I'm going to call it lock object, which is just a type of object. So what are we going to use this for? Well, I'll tell you in just a second. So this lock object is going to be there because we're going to make our constructor, our dictionary provider, and we're going to call it a cached provider. Why? Because we're going to basically use caching, meaning that we don't want to go and hit the database every time. So what in the constructor, what we'll say is that, hey, listen, anytime people come to and want our list of terms from our dictionary, let's make sure and figure out if it already exists. So in our getter, what we're going to do is we're going to lock the lock object, and basically this is what's going to help us. Now, what exactly is lock? Before I go any further, let's talk about lock. Lock is a .NET term, and in it we've got, if you look on MSDN, it basically marks a statement as critical section for mutual exclusion. What that means is it allows you to be thread safe. It's good for thread synchronization. So for example, we can just create an object and use lock on it and say, listen, whatever happens in there, please make sure it's mutually exclusive. Now, this is useful for scenarios where, again, multiple threads could be accessing it. So in our scenario, we've got a dictionary, we've got multiple people hitting it. And if I'm caching it, what I'm doing is I'm going to make sure that the list stays in memory on our web server so I don't have to keep hitting the database to look it up because it's an access database. I don't want to go back to the database because it's just a dictionary. I'm not editing this data. So this makes a great sense. And this is one of the best practices you want to think about. On a certain scenario, if you don't have too much data, you don't need editing, caching is a great option. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use this lock object to do that. All right. Next, we're going to basically say, listen, if cache provider is null, then we're going to create it. So cache provider doesn't exist, then we're going to new it up. And of course, it's either the dictionary provider, and then we want to have a way to create the terms as well, because the terms is a list of Ayurvedic dictionary provider. So if this is empty, create it. Now, we're not going to have an else because we're always just going to return cache provider. All right, so let's take a look and see what we're doing here. We're basically saying, look, if this cache provider is empty, then create it and create the terms, and then return it. But if it's not empty, then return it anyways because I've got it cached. And so that is our simple approach. Now, of course, when we create these terms, we're going to need a way to populate the terms. And so let's create a method called populate terms, and in it we're going to pass our cached provider and its terms. So terms is what will get worked on in populate terms. Now, I want to show you, this is, as you're probably familiar in Visual Studio, it gives you these helpful terms when something goes with a red squiggly. It says, hey, you got a problem here, and you can use this light bulb to figure out what it is. And it says, look, you don't have this method. And you can use it to generate these methods. So it's a helpful little item that I really like. So let's go ahead and create our method that's going to call the list of terms. So we're going to make a static, and it's not going to return anything because it's going to work on the item that gets passed in. So we're going to make populate terms, and it is basically going to need a list of terms. So again, we're passing in terms, and locally we're going to call it terms. Now, this is basically boilerplate code that you will recognize. So let's just go through it. So the first thing is we're going to need an access data source object because we've got an access data source. Now, At this point, Visual Studio says, yes, but you didn't really include some using clauses. So let's bring in the proper using clauses. We need system web UI controls. All right, let's bring that in. Next, we need to point to our file path. And then, of course, we're going to need a select command. Now, so far, you can see I've got a very simple setup. My data access simply says, I've got access database. It's in my app data. I need to get everything from the terms database, and it's going to return to me a view. Let's fix these using statements here. I believe this is using system.collections. Yes. Okay. So now that we have this IEnumerable set, we're just going to loop through it. So if you can imagine, we've got a data view that comes back from the select statement. And we're just going to say, listen, if the data view is not empty, let's loop through it. And let's fix our system.data. And so as you can see, it's pretty standard that says, listen, I've got a item in there, and each item is of type dictionary term, and use it to populate our list of terms, which is, in this case, just this item. And we add each of those items back to the list of terms, which gets in our cached provider. So that's it. That's all we have. Now, I want to include one other method rather than make, it's good practice, rather than just expose terms as a property, let's make a method. So we're going to create something called getTerms, which also returns a list of items, and it's just our terms. Now, one other method that we've included in our sample is this thing called refreshTerms. Now, refreshTerms is basically a way to clear the cache, and once we clear the cache, we know what it's going to do. It's going to set it to null, which means it's going to try to repopulate it. Now, why do we do that? Well, that's because if your online dictionary tends to change maybe daily or maybe hourly, if you need a way for that cache to get invalidated so that it goes and gets the data again or reads from the database, this is a way to do that. So again, refreshTerms could be useful if you want to refresh the cached item. Okay, that's enough with data access. Now we've got pretty much what we need. Let's move on and create the UI. So for the UI, I'm going to start with a default aspx page for the main page. Now let's start and create a default aspx, and in it you'll find it's actually pretty bare bones. So our main page, I'm going to come in here and go to Toolbox. And our toolbox has basically a hyperlink in it. So if we take a look at this code here, you'll see the main default aspx page is really pretty empty. So I'm going to pretty much bring in this exact same code because it's just a link to two versions. Now, you can see I've got a folder called dictionary, and this is good for separation of concerns. But in essence, I'm going to make one with the default aspx grid view and one with the bootstrap ASP grid view. Well, the bootstrap grid view is what we're calling it. Now, I'm not going to dive too much into the bootstrap grid view today, just because I'm going to have a full webinar on it soon. Because again, the bootstrap controls are very close to release if you've been signed up and following them. Okay, so in our toolbox, we're going to find under navigation or common controls, you find a aspx hyperlink. Now, under the div here, we're going to go toolbox, aspx hyperlink, and I like to go to the design view. Now, why do I do that? Because what happens is if you don't have certain references, a process gets kicked off in Visual Studio that generates this license file and adds the proper references and updates the web config and all that. All right, so once in a while, when you're on it, you want to do that. In my particular case, I said I'm just going to replace this with this version because it's just two hyperlinks and it's just looking for a folder called dictionary. And in it, I've got the aspx grid view sample and the bootstrap grid view sample. So let's do that. Let's add a folder. Now, the reason I'm adding a folder, it's helpful when you've got a certain functionality. So in our case, our dictionary-based views, I want them here. Now, you know, in ASP.MVC, this isn't really a choice. It's, you know, by convention. You know, you really have to start separating concerns there. So it's kind of useful. Again, this is another best practice you want to think about to kind of separate your code out And it makes it easier when you're doing unit testing and debugging and all that kind of good stuff. All right, so in dictionary, I want to have another file called default aspx that will be our aspx grid view one. And so we're going to make another web form. We'll call it default. And this is where we're going to add our aspx grid view. So under toolbox asp.net, I'm going to start adding it. And now we can start thinking about ASP grid view. So under data and analytics, you'll find aspx grid view. And again, kick off that design process once in a while. So you can completely use our little smart task here, or this designer that allows you to really customize the aspx grid view. And this is a fantastic feature. I've shown it in what's new. We've got a feature browser that gets better with each release. So we can use this. And again, a lot of the properties are available here, you know, client-side items, adaptive details, all that good stuff is here. But for this webinar, I'm not going to use the properties or that designer what I showed. I'm going to use the source view. And the reason is I want to show you the considerations that went into some of these decisions. So let's talk a little bit about that. So in the default ASPX, I've got just this ASPX grid view. So let's start by going through it. Now, the first thing is I'm going to change the ID to sort of match what you're going to find in the demo, which is GV, just grid view for short. And the first thing is we're going to set the client ID mode. Now, this is actually a property of ASP.NET, ASP.NET Web Forms, and this is something Microsoft introduced several releases ago. And what it does, if you've ever seen view source on your Web Forms controls, sometimes you'll see that the ID property tends to be this really weird long ID. When I use static, it's basically going to set it to the same as the server ID for the ASPX grid view. So that's a useful property, and you can learn more about it on MSDN. Okay, next we want to set a client instance name. Now, client instance name is a DevExpress property, and this basically allows us to create a client's instance object. Now, if you're not familiar, all DevExpress ASP.NET controls that support client-side features, events, have a client-side object. And the way you access it is, it's basically, if you, whatever the server-side controls name is, ASPX grid view, you insert ASPX and the word client before the rest of the word, and you get the client-side object that represents that server-side object. Now, what's great is this client-side object has events and so forth that use callbacks and talk back to the server side. And so we're going to be using these client-side properties to talk to some features on the server side, as you'll see in a minute. And that client-side name, it's called Search Grid View. Now, if I don't create this client instance name, a client-side object doesn't get created. And this is useful to know because these are the kind of considerations you want to make for what features do you need and not need, because the grid can do a lot of things. If you enable everything the grid can do, well, the grid will obviously be heavier because it has to load more resources. The scripts and so forth that needs to get loaded are much bigger. So definitely consider what features you need. And so let's go ahead and add some more items. All right. So beyond that, I also want to set the width property to 100%. Now, this is what's going to allow us to make the grid responsive, because this essentially says, hey, listen, the grid is going to have variable size, and as I resize, I want you to resize the grid with it. Next, we're going to set the key field name property. Now, you might say, well, I'm not actually doing any editing, so what do I need key field name property for? Key field name is very useful for many operations beyond just editing. It's also useful when you've got sorting or grouping, but in our case, we've got filtering enabled. And so that's where you absolutely want to make sure you got key field name enabled. Now, I'm going to set auto generate columns equal to false because, as you remember, our grid view is basically just a single column. So we're not going to use the standard grid view layout. We're going to make our own. Now we're going to set the enable rows cache to false. Now this is a consideration as well. So enable rows cache is a property of our grid view that allows you to determine whether data caching is enabled. Now by default, the grid view stores data in memory for quick access, but you might not want to enable it in certain scenarios. And so in our scenario, we've got caching enabled on the data, so our grid is already light and fast. So to keep the rendering of the grid fast, we're going to disable rows cache. But in certain scenarios, you may want to use it. Again, this is one of those best practice considerations you want to think about. All right, next we want to set enable paging gestures to false. Now what are paging gestures? This again is a feature of the grid view that we introduced. It's a nice feature. So what it does is the grid view, when it detects that it's in a browser that is touch enabled, it will allow the end user to page using touch. And so what happens is you can click on these items, or you can touch the screen and move it back and forth. And what it'll do is it'll produce that nice little animation to kind of give them like, hey, you're paging back and forth. Now, in our particular case, I'm disabling this just because, not that I don't expect to be used on it, but I don't need that gesture. And so I'm not going to load it in my grid. Now, if you want to keep it, by all means, leave it enabled. Okay, next we want to set the enable view state to false because we don't need to keep state between our views just because we are not doing anything particular that says, listen, I got to have that feature enabled. Okay, next we want to create our columns. So let's do that. I'm going to set it by calling columns, and it's only going to really have one column. So we'll call it dx grid view text, grid view data text column, and this is just a single column we're going to have. Now why is that? Well, because it's basically just a single column that we're going to calculate ourselves. So for the field name property, which is necessary, I'm going to give it a custom name and I'm going to call it calculated. Well, why is that? That's because it's a unbound column. So we're going to set its unbound type to string. And the reason is because I'm going to calculate it myself. So the unbound expression property is what's going to tell this grid which columns we tend to use when we bind it. Now we're going to bind it on the server side. And so during the rendering on ASP.NET, it's going to say, oh, okay, well, these are the columns I'm looking for in the data source, and how I want to display them will be determined by a template. Now, if you're not familiar with templates, it's a great property. So we're going to use the data item template property of this control to define exactly what it looks like. So in our case, a data item template gives you complete free form to say, listen, I want certain items bolded, I want certain items shown. So how do we access it? Well, in ASP.NET, we've got this, less than %, and then you pass in this pound sign, and then we can basically eval just about anything in here. So it could be a column name, it could be a formula, but in our case, what I want to do is we're going to eval this name of this column that we want to display, and just to show you, we're going to want to, let's say, also we'll put in the English text here. Now I want to make sure before I do that, it is inside the proper brackets. So we're going to say %, pound, and of course this English text. Okay, now this allows us to basically evaluate for this column so that it's going to say, listen, this is exactly how I want to display the column. I want to have a paragraph, I want this column to be bolded, and I want the English text on the right side. Now we've got a couple of other columns that I'm going to use in just a second, but let's now data bind this. So we've got our grid essentially set up. As you can see, it's got a list view, it's got a single column. Now, I'm going to hit F7. Now, in our server side, what we want to do is basically we want to data bind this. So we're going to call gv.dataSource, and we're going to point to the Ayurvedic dictionary terms. But at this point, I'm not finding it anywhere. What's going on? I've got my item in app code. So what's happening? I've got a namespace, grid best practices 1, and this 2 is called grid best practices 1. So what's happening? Maybe I need to call grid best practices.appcode in our using clause. So let's try that. So let's say using grid best practices app. Nope, it's not finding. It's only finding dictionary. So something is happening. Well, I want to bring your attention to this because this tends to be one of those things. And if you Google for this, you'll find a very nice Stack Overflow thread where hundreds of people have also run into this. And that is classes residing in app code are sometimes not accessible. Why is that? Because they don't get compiled. So the trick is to basically come in here, look at your app code, right click on your class, go to its properties, and that's set the build action to compile. And that's it. And now we can, let me comment this out for a second. We can rebuild this. And when I do that, it's going to compile our class. And it looks like we've got a little error in here. So let's do Control K, Control D. And now let's rebuild this. Now it has compiled our provider. And we can come in here. We can say using grid best practices 101.appcode. And that's it. Now we can refer to that dictionary directly. So now our data source is going to point to Ayurvedic dictionary provider, and I can call directly get terms. And you can see I'm not newing up this dictionary provider. Why? Because we had that class set up that says, listen, anytime I just call the method, I want you to check if it's null, new it up, and if it's already cached, just load it up. So this is where our UI gets very simple. All right, so now that we've got the data source set, of course, we need to call good old data bind. Okay, now that we've done that, let's take a look at this in the browser. So I'm gonna hit Control F5. Now, we can see our grid has essentially a very nice look to it. Yeah, you can see I've got the single column, and I've got a column header I don't really want, and it's probably got sorting enabled and all these paging items. So we've got some work that we still need to do. What's nice about it is our grid view, you can see, is responsive. Because I set the width to 100%, the grid is already responsive. The site isn't necessarily responsive, but we'll take care of that in just a second. All right, so let's go on. And I'm gonna bring in one other server-side method here. Now, I said this is best practices, and it's 99.9% best practices, except for this one thing. And that is, we're gonna bring in a piece of code. Now, before I bring it in, I wanna talk a little bit about Search Panel. Now, Search Panel, if you're not familiar, is a feature we added to the grid view that is fantastic. I love it. I mean, the grid is so powerful in its filtering options with the filter control and filter and all that so forth. The Search Panel is something we added recently that basically searches across all the columns in the grid. So for example, if I was looking for, let's say, Spain, it's gonna go and find it in the country column. But let's say I'm looking for just a term like ROM, it's going to find all the columns that have the term ROM and quickly filter that. Now, not just does it filter that, it also highlights that particular search term. Now, this is a very powerful thing. Now, the grid does this automatically whenever you enable the search panel. However, if you have an unbound column, then it becomes a little tricky to get that highlighting feature to work. And so that's the bit of code I'm gonna bring in. Because I've got an unbound column, it won't automatically highlight the term. It will search it, but it may not highlight it. So what we wanna do is I've got this little bit of code that is not a best practice. So let me explain what it does. Basically, it calls get highlighted text. And we're going to call this from the client side. Yep, I said client side. It's on the server side. And because we've got that client side object, the grid view makes it easy to call these server side methods. And again, that's a nice best practice when you want to have certain code. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the column value at the time that it's data binding and figure out, is this a highlighted text item? Should I be highlighting it? And I'm going to pass it to another method that says highlight search panel text. And in it, I've got basically this thing that says aspx grid view that points to our grid view. And I'm calling it internal method. Now, this is not a best practice. So why do we include it? Now, because we are working on a way to expose this, and we'll figure out the best way to expose this in a future release. So for now, don't worry. When we do, if in the future releases, we're going to update that Code Central sample so you'll know exactly the best way to do this. For now, we're simply doing some reflection on the particular item and figuring it out and calling the internal grid renderer to basically highlight it and bind it back to the calculated text. Okay, so let's use this get highlighted text on the client side. So I'm going to update our template here, and let's bring in a little bit of more code and also have it call our get highlighted text. So I'm going to hit Control K, Control D, which is a nice Visual Studio shortcut to align all the text in here. But basically now I'm calling get highlighted text, and it's going to highlight any of the columns that we feel may be necessary. So here you can see I've got the international term, the Kyoto, the Devanagari, as well as the English term. And now our item will look a lot better. Now, let's go on and make a little more settings for the grid to enable it to look better and behave better. So I want to set the settings show column headers to false because I don't want to show any it's a simple list view. So I'm also going to disable some other features like dragging and dropping, grouping, as well as sorting. Again, this list is a list view approach, and this is those necessary features. I don't need those features. My scenario is I've got a dictionary that's just used for lookup. So I'm going to disable editing as well. So no deleting, editing, inserting, and so forth. But I do want to enable the search panel feature, which is going to allow our end users to search through it. And I also want to enable our pager. So before I do that, let's actually save this and take a look at it in the browser again. Now, so far, whoops, I got a little problem here. Let's go back and fix this. And I've added all my features before columns. So let me make sure we add it after columns because those features are not part of columns. All right, so next, what we want to do is basically, let's say Control D and rerun this. And basically, our grid now has a search panel. As you can see, we've hidden this column header, and it's starting to look a lot better. You can see I've got the term, the layout looks nice, and so I've got it all pretty much set up. But I've got this pager. Now, when I click on this pager item, you can see the URL doesn't change. And that's what's happening is, that's because only the grid view is updating here. Now, this is not a good scenario when you want to have a public site that maybe Google can potentially cache. So what we want to do is we want to generate URLs that are SEO friendly, because search engines like hard links. They don't like data that is hidden within callbacks and so forth. And so for this, we have a property that makes it easy for you to do that. So the pager has a property in it for SEO particularly that can do that, as well as this property that allows it for adaptivity. So in this case, what happens is when it starts to lose it, you can see the pager starts resizing depending on how much it has in there. So we're going to enable both features right now. So I'm going to bring in this little bit of code for settings pager. So settings pager basically says, listen, I only want to have 30 items that I display in it. I can make it less. I'm happy with 30. And I'm going to enable that adaptivity feature that I mentioned. But I want to limit the number of buttons that are displayed to only 3. Because as you saw before, I can have 10 or so buttons, but I only want to keep it to about 3 buttons and make the URLs SEO friendly. And the summary text is going to have this template layout. All right. So, and beyond that, I'm going to add one simple style here that makes the bottom border at width to 0 pixels. All right, let's take a look at this in the browser now. And as you can see, our pager now has only 3 or 4 buttons. And when I click on it, I've got friendly URLs. So, and on top of that, if you go to the developer mode, as I resize this, it'll give me a pager that will automatically adapt to whichever setup you're using. So again, it's a very nice feature of the grid view that makes it easy to start using it. Now, let's move on, and I want to talk about how do we now take this site. More or less, it kind of looks friendly for mobile, but how do you get it really mobile friendly? Well, I talked about the concerns of the grid. Now, when you talk about responsive really is a feature of the site. So what we want to do is we want to bring in Bootstrap. Bootstrap is fantastic. Bootstrap is popular, very popular for a reason, because it makes life easy when you want to have something that is working on mobile, desktop, and so forth. And so we're going to bring in Bootstrap and just use it to get that responsive features and so forth. And you can see how easy it is. So to start with, to bring Bootstrap into your website, I recommend just going and using NuGet to bring it in. So if you right click on your project and go to Manage NuGet Packages, we can just search for it. And I'm going to search and bring in, and I'll call it Bootstrap. Now, the NuGet Package Manager allows you to get pre-releases. I recommend getting the latest stable. And when you hit install, what it will do, it will not just get Bootstrap and all everything that's necessary for it with CSS and scripts, it will also get any dependencies. So in this case, the dependency it has is on jQuery, so it's going to bring in both. And once it does, it's going to tell you, hey, I'm going to bring in jQuery and Bootstrap. Are you okay with it? And I'm going to say yes, bring in both in. And as it does, it generates a packages config file as well as the folders. Now, in this particular case, it created a content folder with the CSS and map files, as well as a script folder for the JS files. Now, what we want to do is we want to create a page that allows us to have Bootstrap on it, and then we can just put our grid inside of that. Now, rather than make multiple pages, what I'm going to do is I want to use a master page. And if you're not familiar with ASP.master pages, again, it's a good best practices to learn about them because they allow you to reuse code. That means I can have a master page that has a menu on it or Bootstrap on it, and then just bring in a particular sub page or detail page that has a particular control or functionality on it. All right, so to do that, I'm going to make in our dictionary page a master page, and we're going to call it Bootstrapped. Now, you can call it anything you like, but basically this will basically make a master page. Now, what is a master page? Essentially, it's the same thing, except it generates for us this content placeholder. Now, I'm going to take this content placeholder, bring it outside, and we're going to replace all of this with Bootstrap. Now, in this particular demo, all we did was we went to the Bootstrap website, clicked Getting Started, and clicked on Basic Template here, and said, yeah, that basic template looks good. Let's bring that in. Because this basically has the meta tags, the link to the ref, as well as simple hello world message, which we'll replace, but the script files that are necessary to start using Bootstrap. You don't have to think too much about it. So I like this example. If you don't want this example, feel free to use one of these. They have the code for these as well. So basically, we're just going to bring this piece of code in. Now, You can see, though, that we're going to need to use our form here because basically in master pages, this is what determines where the detail page gets inserted. So I don't need hello world, so I'm going to replace that with our form as well as where the content will be placed. And I also want to change one other thing. You can see that the link here is pointing to something called CSS, and guess what? We don't have CSS, we have content. So this is where our bootstrap min.css is. So I'm going to update this and make sure you get the right backslash. Sometimes you need dot dot backslash. So in this case, I'm going to say backslash content to point to the right min CSS file. And for the JavaScript file, I don't have a JS folder. I have a scripts folder. So I want to make sure that I point to the right items. Okay, now we got the master page, and you may want to change the title and so forth. But how do we derive off of it? Well, to create a detail page, I'm going to make a another page, and I'll call this, let's call this Bootstrap grid view. And I'm going to have it derive off of this Bootstrap master page. Now I did this because I wanted this bit of code to show you, yes, I can recreate my default aspx page. But really, when you are creating a detail page, you just want to worry about the key functionality. Now I know in my master page, I already have a form and a div, and I don't need all this doc HTML stuff. So I'm going to delete this stuff, and instead, we're going to bring in the little bit of code that I showed earlier, which is this content placeholder. So this content placeholder is really the only thing that I need to worry about, and that says that's going to get inserted into the master page. The other thing is I can't have two at page tags. I just need to either take this master page file up there or update the second line to point to the right references. So for example, the code behind here is not Bootstrap grid view, but default grid view, and the it doesn't inherit from Bootstrap grid view, but underscore default. And then I can remove this line. Okay, now we have changed our default aspx view to derive off of the bootstrapped master page. So let's take a look at this in the browser. Now, when we take a look at this in the browser, it should look the same. And you might say, well, how do I really know it's Bootstrap? Well, let's add a simple nav bar to this. And to do that, what we've done is we've taken a static nav bar. So if you go to the Bootstrap nav bar examples, and if you take a look at the page source, you can see they've got a static nav bar. And all we did was basically did something like this, where we just did cut and paste. And we did that just to show you how easy it is to bring code like this into your sample. So if you go back to bootstrap.master here, I can come in and I can say, listen, right before we do this, I want to bring in this nav bar. Now, when this nav bar simply has a link to something called home and about. Now, I'm not going to create the about page. It's a simple about page that you can see in the online demo. But what it does is it gives us a static nav bar at the top. Now, because I've got the static nav bar, I'm going to bring in a little CSS code that we've done. And I'm going to create this. I'm going to define this div as a class container. And because Bootstrap is a very powerful thing, and again, I'll get more into Bootstrap in a future webinar. It's too deep to go into this webinar. But Bootstrap works like this. When you set classes like navbar or default and static or container, Bootstrap understands what these items are and is able to generate them. Okay, so in our case, I want to bring in a little bit of code, and you can see this a simple bit of code in our best practices example as well. And if you take a look at custom CSS, I'll bring this. It's got very bit of code, 3 amounts of code, and I'll explain that in just a second. So I'll just bring it in just so that it looks good, and we'll put it in our content here and say add style sheet, and we'll call it custom. And it's basically just says, listen, I don't have a top margin for my static toolbar. The container, I want it to have a max width of 700 pixels. I don't want it to span the entire width. And finally, the containers HR, the horizontal rule, I want it to have a 30 pixel margin as well. Okay, now because I've got this custom CSS, it won't actually make any sense until I bring it into our master page as well. And to do that, we'll simply drag the link in here as well. Okay, now if we take a look at our default aspx page, we can see we're looking more and more like our sample, because now I've got our width that we've set. I've got a couple of buttons here, and if I take a look at this and the dev tools and say, listen, if I start resizing this, is this really Bootstrap? And bam, look at that, it's Bootstrap. Just by bringing in the Bootstrap NuGet package, bringing in that template, we've enabled that functionality. Okay, now I'm gonna stop here, and I just to save some time for questions and so forth. Now one of the things that we've added in this sample is we've added a Bootstrap grid view version. And so why do we do that? Well, we did that to kind of show you that our upcoming Bootstrap grid view is very similar. We try to add as many features that are similar to the ASP.NET grid view, but it's not the same control. And I'm going to be talking about this in a future webinar. But you'll see that it's got some slight differences. It's got the rounded corners like you'd expect from Bootstrap. And the key thing is it basically implements theming like Bootstrap. So the current ASP.NET controls have their own set of themes, and we weren't going to try to rewrite those. So instead, we've got this new set of controls that work great with Bootstrap. And we'll talk about that in a future webinar. So with that, let me just recap a little bit about what we saw and some of these best practices. When you're considering data access, if you've got a scenario where, and like our case, it's an online dictionary, many people can access it. Well, think about caching. You're going to keep it loaded on the web server because there's only about 5,000 terms. Your web server can handle that. It's one table with 5 columns. And so we can leverage our web server and say keep that cached, and then keep the grid UI light with only the necessary features. We only wanted filtering. We disabled the other stuff. So we did that. And we made it SEO friendly because we're generating hard URLs, and we were leveraging Bootstrap to make it mobile friendly. And again, you can find all of these in our online sample. If you go to DevExpress.com, and if you just look for this T476106 in our support, and I'll have a follow-up blog post to this where you can see exactly all the links that I mentioned in here as well. Okay, with that, I thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. Amanda, let me hand it back to you.
Hey, Mehul. All right, so we actually don't have any questions yet.
Okay, well, if we don't have questions, let me state that please reach out to me. Tell me what you think about this webinar. Any questions about it? You know, what are some of why we made some of the decisions we did for best practices? And again, best practices are guides. They're not hard set rules. This is all, you know, everything in programming, as you know, is contextual. There are some places where it makes sense to do something and other places it doesn't, right? Maybe except global variables, you know, those are generally bad. But in essence, we want you to take these best practices to get you thinking about, don't just drop a control. You know, our controls are very powerful. They can do a lot of things, but to get the most out of them, consider what you want to use them in, what scenario you're doing with them with your website. Now, and also if you have requests, if you're curious about something, let us know. I mean, we've got ideas for all sorts of webinars coming up. So let us know what you want to hear more about. And, you know, feedback is great. We love feedback. Somebody asked an MVC version. You know, everything I showed here today has an MVC version, except for the Bootstrap controls. Now, I'm going to address it real quick in this webinar. people say, listen, Mohol, you've made a set of Bootstrap controls. Great. Why isn't there a MVC version? And because we don't want to make another set of controls, because right now, if you go to devexpress.com, let's do that, okay? And this is one of those considerations, like how do you best present a technology? So if you look at ASP.NET, at the moment, we have the ASP.NET Web Forms controls, we have the ASP.NET MVC controls. And then on the client side, we have the DevExtreme controls. Now, DevExtreme has a set of MVC wrapper controls. They work with the ASP.NET Core, and they don't work with they're not like the traditional ASP.NET controls, meaning that they'll work in ASP.NET, but when you want to do eventing and so forth, they use client-side JavaScript. Now, we've got a new set of controls called Bootstrap. And so this is the challenge. In software, there's never one right answer for everything. And so this Bootstrap is going to work great for a certain set of you out there. So we're going to produce that, but it's for web forms. And the reason we're not making it for MVC, and I'm going to have a webinar about, again, Bootstrap and our approach to MVC versus web forms, and that's because DevExtreme provides Bootstrap support. And DevExtreme has MVC wrappers that support Bootstrap. And so we're going to support that coming up. But for everything I showed today with the standard ASP grid view, standard ASP grid view has an MVC equivalent, MVCX grid view. And that works the same way that I talked about today. So you can create everything I showed today in MVC. So if you'd rather see a version of this in MVC, we can absolutely, let me know. If we get enough requests, we'll ask the devs to create an MVC version. It's not difficult, but really, we don't want to just keep making samples. And we thought the best thing is, web forms gets a different thing, different knocks against its performance stuff. Web forms is very performant. It all depends on how you set it up.
Okay, great. We have had actually several questions come in.
Awesome.
I think you can see. Just a quick question regarding the future of Bootstrap controls. Will we need to bring in the Bootstrap NuGet packages as well?
Let me address all of that. So this is, again, a yes and no answer. I'm sorry, I don't want to cop out like that. But let's say for example, if we'll likely have a file new experience. And if you're using our template gallery, no, right? Because we're going to include that in there. It's a Bootstrap based project template, right? Just like Microsoft brings it into their project template, we'll do a similar thing because you were intending to use Bootstrap. In fact, we have a Bootstrap project template today that you can use with our current controls. And that brings in Bootstrap. So for example, if I do this and if I go ASP.NET, and we've talked about this before, this isn't for the upcoming Bootstrap controls. This is just because people were going, hey, DevExpress, are your controls friendly with Bootstrap? Well, yes, except for the part where they don't work great with a Bootstrap theming. And that was the big divide, and that's why we made the Bootstrap controls. So in the future, we'll have likely another Bootstrap web application template as well. But more than that, if you were going to make just a file new empty web application, then yeah, you'll have to bring it in as a NuGet.
Can we assume the sample source code used in this webinar will be made available?
Oh yeah, well, it's available now. You can go right now to T476106, and you know what? Let me show you the sort of the short way. I think you can just go devexpress.com/support 476106, right? So I think you can go, I think question mark sample equals, you know what? Let me just do this. Go to support. The only thing is you'll have to log into support. But if you go to code examples, you can see that it'll go right to it. Now you can browse through all our four code samples, or you can go T476106 and hit search, and you'll go right to this best practices example. And if you click this example runner, this will download it, or if you've already installed this, just click example and it will open this directly into Visual Studio. Everything I showed you today will be right available to you. Now, let me address another question, Amanda, that I just saw. Somebody asked, what about a SQL Server based best practices example? Listen, what I showed today is completely possible with SQL Server as well. What's the difference? Well, if you take a look at your app code, this is really where you define. So you can make your provider still be cached. The only thing that would change is this populate terms. Instead of going through access, this is where you would do your select command against, maybe using Entity Framework to go to SQL Server. So it's really, the reason we're using access is it's a simple sample, right? We've got one table, but it is possible. The idea here is take a look at your scenario. Don't load up, don't cache a ton of data, because then you'll get the opposite of a performant website. You'll actually make your web server too slow. And in many cases, it's better to go just search against SQL because you don't have too many users, or SQL Server is fast enough, or so forth. So you want to really weigh the pros and cons. I mean, there's a sort of like a fine-tuned line where you have to say, okay, if it's too much on one side versus the other, what consideration do you use? All right, other questions? Okay, somebody says, for another scenario where data comes from a variable data source, like parameterized query, sure. Again, how do I put this? Let's say, for example, our page, let's go back to the demo. Let's say, for example, I wanted to load this with a default filter item. You can do that. You can pass that in and it will filter that automatically. Where will that happen? Well, because we're caching the data, the grid is going to do that on the web server. So it's completely possible. But if your consideration is, hey, I've got 1 million rows, well, number one, don't cache the data. And two, let the database do that and use something like the DevExpress ASP.NET server mode feature that basically says, listen, I want SQL Server to do that. And you can see demos of this on our website if you go to data binding and take a look at large database server mode support. And so again, it's one of those features. So for example, when I filter and look for something like Tom here, it's not doing this at the server side. It took half a second to go through 500,000 records. And so this is a consideration you have to think about, that our grid, the database in SQL Server has been optimized. It's been indexed with the right columns for the search and all that. So for example, I can go and say, give me all the Toms with the checked items. And you can see it keeps it light and fast. Had I cached this on the web server, it might be very slow. So again, it's a consideration, and you can pass in parameterized queries. Again, it all depends on that app code, and you have to make consideration as to where that operation will occur. Will it occur on your web server, or will it occur on your backend? I recommend, if you're going to make parameterized queries, you may want to consider, depending on how much data you have, that you keep it on the backend and use server mode for that. Okay, I don't know if there's a whole lot of other things. Take a look for a upcoming, and this is, shameless self-promotion again, devexpress.com/Mehul will take you right to my blog, and there will be a blog post here that refers to the video as well as any questions and the Code Central sample as well. And of course, reach out to me on Twitter at Mehul Harry as well, where you'll find all sorts of good stuff. With that, Amanda, let me hand it back to you. And thank you, everyone, for joining. It's always a pleasure, as I've said. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mehul. All right, everybody, like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be made available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I actually posted the link to our channel in the chat box. And we have more webinars coming up. We are always adding new sessions. Next Tuesday, March 28th, ASP.NET MVC, Frequently Asked Questions Answered, presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Don Wibier. And then April 4th, Demystifying DevExpress Charts with DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknell and DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher. So those are our upcoming webinars, and I'm sure we'll have more webinars added soon. You can register for them at devexpress.com/webinars. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Mehul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.